Ayan na, mga kameta! Kamusta kayo dyan? How are you? Yan! Mahirap na magsalita. Baka mapagalitan tayo ni Madam. Ayan na. Hindi. Totoo ba yan? Or fake news yan, mga kameta? Sabi ko, baka naman fake news na naman yan. Kasi naalala niyo last time na quote si Madam. Ukol dun sa issue ng ABS-CBN ba? Yung parang gagawa rin kami ng sarili namin media, yung gano'n. Di ba para fake news pala yan? Pero totoo yung research, yung gano'n, di ba? Yung pinagalitan yung taga-gobyerno nun sa agriculture. Research kayo dyan. Yan. Ayan tuloy, napagalitan na naman si Kuya. So confirm ba yan? Kasi dami nagme-message sa akin, no, may mga videos sila na confirm pala, na inaway-away pa na, ano ba yung ginawin? Ibang klase talaga. Ano bang konteksto nung inaway yung gwardiya? Ano bang konteksto, mga kameta? Hindi ko talagang Pilipinas, mga kameta. Talagang Pilipinas! Ayan talaga, mga Pilipinas. Talagang mga ano natin, senyora. Ayan, okay. Now, obviously, mga kameta, wala pa yatang statement of denial, apology, anything. So, hintayin natin yan, mga kameta. Pero, habang wala pa yung mga ganyan, sige, magmukhang DJ tayo. DJ. Yeah. So, habang walang ganun, mga kameta, ano sasabihin natin? Oh, by the way, hindi Dolomite. Hindi Dolomite yung, yung pictures ko sa beach, Legit yan. Unless, baka nga, Dolomite. Napaisip tuloy ako. O nga, baka Dolomite yan. Pero hindi ko pa nalasaan yung Dolomite dyan sa Manila, Manila Bay kasi mahirap na. Baka kailangan natin ng toxicology afterwards. Di ba yung may mga picture na taga Eastern Europe, mga Czech Republic, ganun. Sabi ko, naku pa, toxicology niya mga yan. After sila humiga ng hubad-hubad dyan sa Manila Bay. Naku po, mahirap na. Siguro pag nag-apply tayo ng visa ulit sa US, pag pumila ka na, tapos ka na mag-apply ng visa, pupunta ka dyan sa Dolomite Beach, magpa-relax ka muna dyan. Pero anyway, mga kameta, for me, I'm not gonna make any statement particularly on this incident. Kayo na bahala humusga dyan. Tignan muna natin kung may confirmation, may statement of apology, whatever. Pero ito, mga kameta, ayan, kulang ng tulog kasi kagabi, kagabi jogging tayo ng 10 kilometers, mga kamera. 10 kilometers tayo kagabi. Grabe, pagod ako. Salamat dito sa kape nila dito. Grabe, lakas ng kape nila dito, no? Kaya, 8 a.m. hanggang 4 a.m. ang araw natin kahapon. And then the day before was essentially just few hours and then hanggang gabi na naman. So, medyo intense yung mga works natin. Kaya, pasensya na, mga kameta. Wala tayong gym. Wala tayong bodybuilding session, kaya kung medyo sloppy tsura natin, pag mag-bash na kayo, unahin ko na kayo, alright? Pasensya na mga kameta. Now, for me, actually, I'm reading now a book called Asia's Godfathers. It's a fantastic book by Joe Stodwell, who also I recommended for another book na sinulat niya. And actually, you have to read these two books together, no? Sabay sila dapat basahin. We'll go more into the detail of that book. It's a fantastic book which looks at the oligarchs in Southeast Asia. Oligarchs in Thailand, oligarchs in Philippines, obviously, oligarchs in Indonesia, Malaysia. It tries to explain why is the composition of the oligarchs mostly from ethnic minorities, Indian and Chinese in some of the places in Southeast Asia, some of them Espanol in the case of the Philippines, and it also explains how much these oligarchs or / godfathers / tycoons, right, have contributed to the development or not so contributed to the development of their country. No, so it's a fantastic book. I'll go more into the detail on that, mga kameta. Pero binabasa pa natin. It's a fascinating book. Sinimulan siyang basahin. I was hoping to read it for a long time. Matagal na natin na binili yan. Saan yung iPad ko? Ay, ito, mga kameta. Ayan, ito. Ito, mga kameta. Para makita niyo yung sinasabi natin, okay? So ito, it's a fantastic book. because there's a lot of that. Ito yung book, guys. Okay. Tingnan niyo, pag ako nagsulat, ganyan ako mag-notes, okay? Super detailed tayo mag-notes, mga kameta. Ganun ako mag-notes. So you could see, like, I really look at the data, details, everything. It's a very good book. Let me just show the cover. Ayan. Punta ka muna dito, wag ka makulit. Ito. So ito yung libro. I really suggest you guys read it. It's a fantastic book. Gives you a lot of data, a lot of history, a lot of context. I really want you guys to read it because it gives you a perspective on why a lot with ethnic minority background came to dominate the economies in Southeast Asia. It's a fantastic book by Joe Stodwell, who's a journalist, but also he has a PhD in economics from Cambridge University. So a perfect guy. He explains it in a fascinating way. He interviewed a lot of these godfathers, tycoons, oligarchs, whatever you want to call them, from Hong Kong to Singapore to Malaysia to Indonesia to Philippines, etc. It's fascinating. So a lot of data is there. I'm hoping to write more on these issues. Balikan natin yan. Now, obviously, the term oligarch was popularized by President Duterte, but actually it has a very specific meaning. In a certain sense, you cannot call the oligarchs in Southeast Asia as oligarchs because the understanding of oligarchies actually has a very Russian Kremlin context. These are a bunch of former KGB, former Soviet insiders, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, among others, who were able to gobble up much of the Soviet industries following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the privatization of state assets. So it has a very specific Russian context, meaning how political connections made certain former operators, apparatchiks, overnight billionaires. But actually, I think the definition of oligarchs should extend way beyond what the Russian context suggests, because I think there are a lot of echoes of that, or varieties of oligarchs all across the world. Essentially, oligarchs refers to people who don't only have entrepreneurial spirit, but also have political connections. And sometimes they're better in one than the other, or they're really good in both. Or they start in one area and then they become strong in another area, or the reverse. So they're like economic tycoons become politicians, or politicians become economic tycoons, etc. So it's a fascinating book. I really suggest you guys to read it. All right. Now, why are we talking about this? Because what's fascinating, this book was written just over 15 years ago. And here in the book, interestingly, Vietnam was kind of dismissed. No? So here, if you look at the first pages, it talks about Vietnam, Laos, and these countries, and says, let's not talk about those countries. They're still very backward, etc. They're not really a big part of the regional economy. So it really focuses. So it says here, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Brunei describe themselves as Southeast Asia, but they return a combined economic output product little more than half of Singapore. Now, the latest data I saw, actually, so this is in the very first page, my quote from Fitzgerald and Hemingway. But actually, so this is more than 10 years ago. Now, if you look at the data, mga kameta, Vietnam's GDP is actually bigger than the Philippines. It's the third largest now already. It's way bigger than Singapore. It's bigger than Malaysia's. It's even bigger than the Philippines. So Vietnam right now is the third largest economy in Southeast Asia per GDP. So here, just over 10 years ago, it was dismissed as not worth even paying attention to. Now, boom, here we are, and Vietnam is in the picture. Now, why do I talk about Vietnam? Vietnam is very interesting, mga kameta, because it also has its own version of business tycoons. But there's one big difference. There's one big difference, mga kameta. And that one big difference is that some of the tycoons here in Vietnam are becoming more and more like chaebols or daihatsus in Japan and Korea. So instead of just cornering real estate market, alam nyo na this, cornering retail, low-end, medium-end services, they're actually moving aggressively into manufacturing and more high-end production. And doon pumapasok yung issue ng manufacturing, mga kameta. And I think this is where Vietnam is becoming more like Northeast Asian countries rather than Southeast Asian countries, because a lot of their tycoons, most especially Mr. Pham, has entered into car manufacturing. So pinag-usapan natin yan, mga kameta, the other, actually more than 2 months ago. And I'll tell you this, mga kameta. May share tayong video mamaya doon sa Instagram natin, ganun nagka-cross tayo ng street. So Vietnam is still this, nag-flex pa ng muscle. Flex pa ng muscle. Then, nagka-cross na yung street, wala pa rin traffic light dito, di ba? But, one thing I noticed is that 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago, when you cross the streets in Vietnam, you'll see a lot of motorbikes. Now, you see a lot of Porsche, BMWs, the latest models, 2022, 2023 models, Bentleys, Benz, ganon. But what really got my attention in Vietnam is their own cars, VinFast, right? This is barely 6-7 year old, and yet now VinFast is already producing in the US, soon in Germany. So if you're in California right now and you buy a VinFast Vietnamese car, EV, you can get a rebate up to $7,500. So medyo sumasabay na sila sa, anong sinasabi niya ito? Bakit? Sabi nito, nag-distract ako. Sabi niya, tumatanda ka, professor, lalo naging pogi. Parang ininsulto ako, tapos binola ako at the same time. Walang no. So now actually I was checking it, VinFast. And rebate. So this is what makes Vietnam fascinating. Vietnam really got into the game just recently, and yet, mga kameta, within very few years now is the only Southeast Asian country with what looks like a truly global brand. No offense to Proton in Malaysia, which is mostly really assembling the foreign brands. So this is it, mga kameta. I mean, come on, look at this. Gorgeous, diba? So yeah, this is the news right now in Vietnam. So this is the VinFast car. So dun sa taas makita niyo nakalagay $7,500. That's the rebate that you can get in the US if you buy this one, the EV edition, electric vehicle edition. And some of them are going to be made in North Carolina or already being made there. So legit, this is Vietnamese cars. So what I really been paying attention to is the Vietnam-made cars here, which have become global cars. So what is the lesson here, mga kameta? If you look at it dito sa Vietnam, their Tycoons are becoming like chaebols. They're building global brands. And let me be very honest about it. It's so hard to be a manufacturing global brand. And actually, VinFast is losing a lot because it's competing with big names like Tesla, not to mention traditional cars like BMW, Porsche, all of them coming in. And by the way, VinFast doesn't afford cheapang car. It affords actually relatively premium level cars. So this is very risky. They're spending a lot of money, and yet, go pa rin ng go, because this is a matter of national pride, this is a matter of nation building, this is a matter of national champions, and I think the government here is doing a very good job of helping their national champions like VinFast to keep on going, no? So yun yung sinasabi ko, mga kameta. Ito yung difference sa atin at mga countries katulad ng Korea, katulad ng ngayon Vietnam, and not to mention China. In these countries, they also have Tycoons, just like us. But these Tycoons are either properly helped and regulated by the state, and a lot of them are patriotic and visionary enough to build global brands that put their country on the map. Now, tell me a single Filipino global brand after having more than a century of Tycoons in the Philippines. What have they built global brands? Anong mga global brands na na-build nila? Wala. Hanggang taga-ano lang tayo, taga-assembly lang tayo ng mga global brands ng ibang bansa. So this is the problem I'm saying, mga kameta. This is the difference. So in this fascinating book, written just over 10 years ago, Vietnam was not even a part of the conversation. Now, Vietnam already has built its own global brand. So yung mga nasa California, nasa US, you'll get to know more about it. You'll learn more about VinFast. And I'm still studying it. I'm looking at it. It's not easy. They're going to face a lot of challenges. But fascinating how far Vietnam has come in terms of not only lifting the living standards of the citizens. So per capita, Vietnam is now wealthier than a Filipino. But it's even, what's even more important than that is the distribution of wealth. Far more unequal ang Pilipinas. And supposedly liberal democracy in the Philippines. And tignan mo yung mga mayaman sa atin. Tignan mo yung mga elected officials natin. How do they behave? Alright? Mga kameta, let's continue this conversation. Sorry, may mga habol pa tayo, mga administrative work and all. Yeah. Ewan ko anong mangyari sa atin pag ganito. At, just calling out people on Twitter, etc. that just gets us so far. What we really need is talagang maayos na presidente at administrasyon to really push our tycoons, oligarchs, whatever you want to call them, to build global brands. Kung isang bansa lang kasing hirap ng Vietnam is now building a global car brand, EV, electric vehicle car brand. I don't understand why the Philippines, which has had oligarchs, tycoons for 100 years at least, has not built even a single one. Hanggang taga-assembly lang ng iba, hanggang real estate, retail, o yung iba pa, land grabbing, whatever. Mahina talaga yung estado natin sa Pilipinas. Kaya yung mga nagsasabi na henyo na mag-federal tayo ganun, they don't know what they're talking about. What we need is a strong state to control our oligarchs, control our warlords, to push for nation building, to push for national brands. Yun yung talagang wala tayo. We don't need dictators, we don't need strongmen. What we need is strong state institutions. Our problem is that we go with dysfunctional democracy, then try to overcorrect by getting dictators in, and then they mess up even more. Because a lot of them are from dynastic trapo background anyway. Anyway, mga kameta, I'll get back to you. Thank you very much again. Ayaw ko mag-drama. And wag na kayo mag-bash dun sa mga pictures natin. Okay, mga kameta, balik na tayo, mag-exercise na tayo, etc. Para get back into shape. Yeah. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. No, but honestly, I also feel a little bit guilty kasi over the past year, nakapunta tayo. Twice ako nag-Ibiza, twice ako dito nagdanang, twice, nagbali pa tayo, etc. Pero hindi ko pa napuntahan yung mga beach natin sa Pilipinas recently. Yung especially, I've never been to Coron or Siargao, etc. And I mean, it's a question of opportunities, etc. Because mostly I'm giving speaking engagement. I was in Bali because I had talks in Jakarta, etc. I was in Ibiza because I had talks in Spain and Europe. I'm here in Danang twice because of conferences and talks here. But one thing I want to say is, ang mahal din mag-travel across the Philippines. And I think that also shows how internal markets in the Philippines are super cornered. It's so expensive in the Philippines, and I don't think that's really a reflection of true market dynamics. I think it's a reflection of the fact that few big conglomerates almost control everything, so they jack up the prices, or they can control the price. Very monopolistic ang Pilipinas. Now, there's nothing wrong with having sometimes semi-oligopolistic situation if it's properly regulated and ensures sustainable exploitation of resources or maximization of resources. But what we have in the Philippines, ewan ko dyan mga kameta. I hope darating araw kung kailan, mas mura pumunta sa mga magandang lugar sa Pilipinas kaysa pumuntang abroad. Kasi mas makahanap ka ng AirAsia na murang flight papuntang Bali or I don't know, abroad, kaysa papunta dyan sa Coron or mga ganon. Alright? It just doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. And as far as food and all is concerned, in Malaysia, which has a per capita income 3 times higher than the Philippines and more than 3 times in purchasing power parity, mas mura yung pagkain doon. Mas mura mag-travel, etc. doon. In fact, Manila is the second most expensive city in entire Southeast Asia just after Singapore. So it's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous situation. Something is really going on. So all countries have tycoons, oligarchs, whatever you want to call them. But some countries have more efficient, more effective, more nationalistic, more patriotic, more dynamic ones than the others. Or less Karen ones. On that note, thank you very much mga kameta and talk to you soon. Oh, di na ako nag-statement dun sa isa dyan. Hintayin natin kung may confirmation or etc. Ayoko mga ano. Anyway, just to be clear, I didn't see any confirmation, may mga videos, etc. But let's see if there's a public statements. But as you see, I don't want to talk about this one issue lang. I want to really zoom it. Go to 30,000 feet and then from there really look at the big picture. Kasi isa sa mga kasama natin kahapon dito na nag-invite sa akin, actually from Korea, yung mga nag-organize. This is like their Harvard Kennedy School guy. And Professor Lim, who's a good friend of mine who organized this, mostly economists yung kasama natin. He's actually an expert in chaebols. Chaebols, Hyundai, Samsung, etc. Ito mga Hyundai, Samsung, mga ganun, mga Hyundai, Samsung, mga ganun, they used to be just like our own tycoons and oligarchs and conglomerates. Low-end services, blah, blah. But they were pushed by the government to go next level through effective trade industrial policy. Yun talagang wala tayo mga kameta. Now, why am I talking about this? Because the other day, I also had a long walk along the stretch here, back and forth, after the conference and workshop, with a friend of ours from India, who is a top technocrat in India and advising the government on industrial policy. Mukhang what's happening right now is India is joining the game. And India wants to be a global manufacturing powerhouse just like China, and they're making the big moves along that line. Importantly, mga kameta, India also is becoming the alternative to China, especially for some of them American or high-end brands. So Apple, iPad, I think some of the Apple products will now be built in India, hindi lang sa Vietnam. And more companies are moving, car manufacturing companies. So India is coming on very, very big, and they're really focusing now on developing their manufacturing sector, hindi lang IT sector, call center nila. And that's where there's a lot of lessons for the Philippines. Sayang, we're just next to Taiwan. We should produce more semiconductors. We're not too far from Japan and Korea. We should be producing, at least assembling more of their cars. But my hope is one day yung mga ating oligarchs, they are billionaires, US billionaires, not Filipino, but US. Kasi Pacquiao rin Filipino billionaire na yan. But I'm talking about US billionaires. Sana naman they invest. My goodness, invest naman tong mga tycoons natin into building manufacturing, high-end manufacturing, something like that. Mag-level up naman sila. 100 years na mayaman yung iba, ganyan pa rin yung mga hanggang ganyan lang sila. Alright? So thank you very much mga kameta. Talk to you soon.